started with the tulsi plant. Priya had watered it every morning since her wedding, the way her mother-in-law had shown her. A small daily ritual meant to bring the new bride luck in her new home. On the 9th morning, she stepped out onto the veranda with the brass lota in her hand and stopped cold. The plant that had been green and thriving the evening before was now completely black. Its leaves curled into brittle fists. Its stem collapsed as if something had drained the life out of it overnight. Her mother-in-law took one look at it and went pale. "Tulsi doesn't die like this," she said quietly. "Not in one night. Not ever." Neither of them knew in that moment that this was only the beginning. Priya had married into the Chaudhary family 6 weeks earlier, into a large old house on the edge of a farming town, a family whose entire history was tied to the land they owned. Generations of the same fields, passed down, worked, and fiercely protected. Her husband, Yash, managed the family's orchards, rows of mango and guava trees that had been in the family for as long as anyone could remember. It was, everyone agreed, a good match, a good house, a good family. For the first few weeks, everything about her new life felt exactly like that. After the tulsi plant, it was the roses along the front wall. 6 bushes, each more than 20 years old, gone brown and skeletal within 2 days of Priya starting her habit of sitting near them in the evening with a book. Then the small vegetable patch behind the kitchen, where every seedling she'd helped the cook plant wilted flat to the soil within a week, while the seedlings on the opposite side of the same patch, planted the same day by someone else, thrived untouched. By the end of the first month, no living plant Priya spent more than a few minutes near seemed able to survive her presence. At first, everyone reached for ordinary explanations. Bad soil, a watering mistake, some kind of blight moving through the property. Yash brought in an agricultural expert from the district office, who tested the soil, the water, even had samples of the dead plants analyzed in a lab 2 towns over. Every result came back clean: healthy soil, uncontaminated water, no fungus, no pest, nothing that could account for plants dying in hours instead of weeks. "Whatever this is," the expert admitted, visibly uncomfortable with his own conclusion, "it isn't agricultural. I don't have another word for what I'm seeing." It was the orchard that finally made the whole family afraid. One evening, Priya walked with Yash through the mango trees at sunset, her hand resting against the bark of the oldest tree on the property, a tree older than Yash's grandfather, the one the family always said had survived 2 droughts and a flood that wiped out every other orchard in the district. By morning, its leaves had gone the color of ash, and by the following afternoon, it stood as bare and lifeless as a tree in the dead of winter, though it was the middle of summer. Yash's father, a man not given to fear, stood beneath it in silence for a long time before finally saying what everyone had been too afraid to say out loud. "This tree has never died. Not once. Not in 90 years. Priya, understandably, spiraled into terror over what this meant about her. She stopped touching anything green in the house, stopped sitting in the garden, stopped helping in the kitchen with anything freshly picked, convinced that she was somehow poison, that her very presence was a kind of slow, silent destruction she couldn't control or explain. She barely slept, watching her own hands as though they belonged to someone else. "Am I doing this?" she asked Yash one night, crying. "Is something wrong with me?" It was Yash's great-aunt, a widow who lived alone in the smallest room of the house, tending her own modest collection of potted plants with fierce devotion, who finally sat the family down. She was the oldest living member of the family who remembered the full, unedited history of the land the house stood on, history that, like so many family histories, had been quietly smoothed over for the sake of comfort. "This land was not always ours," she said. "Before my father-in-law bought it, it belonged to another family, the Rathors, and it wasn't bought fairly. It was taken." She explained, slowly, that 3 generations back, the Rathore family had fallen into debt during a brutal drought year, and Yash's great-great-grandfather, rather than helping a neighboring family through hardship the way custom demanded, had used the crisis to acquire their land at a fraction of its worth, forcing them out with almost nothing. The Rathore matriarch at the time, a woman known throughout the district for her skill with herbs and her devotion to the land itself, had cursed the property as she left it for the last time, not the family who took it, but the land itself, declaring that it would never again fully nourish anyone who claimed it without earning it, that nothing planted by an unearned hand would ever be allowed to thrive. For 3 generations, the great aunt said, the land has mostly forgiven us. Crops grew, the orchard survived. Everyone assumed the old curse, if it was ever real, had faded with time. But a curse tied to land doesn't fade, it waits. And I think, she said, looking gently at Priya, it waits especially for the newest hands to touch it. Every bride who has entered this family since then has been, in some sense, being tested by that same land, asked whether she comes as someone who will finally set right what was taken, or whether she's simply one more hand claiming what was never truly given. Yash's father, shaken, admitted that he had heard fragments of this story as a child, dismissed by his own father as old superstition invented by a bitter woman who lost a land dispute fair and square. But looking now at the dead orchard, the impossible speed of it, the lab results that explained nothing, he no longer had the confidence to dismiss anything. The family spent days trying to trace what had become of the Rathore family, and eventually found them, not far away at all, just 2 villages over, where the descendants of that original matriarch still lived, now working as laborers on land far smaller and far poorer than what had once been theirs. The current head of the Rathore family, a weathered man in his 60s, listened to Yash's father's halting, difficult explanation and confession with a stillness that was harder to sit through than anger would have been. My grandmother used to tell us this story every year, on the day they took the land, he finally said. We stopped telling it eventually. It felt like it wasn't going to change anything, holding on to that anger. I didn't think anyone from your family would ever come here to say what you just said. What followed wasn't a mantra, or a ritual performed by a healer, though the family did eventually consult one, mostly out of habit and hope for reassurance. What actually seemed to matter, according to everyone who was there, was what happened next. Yash's father formally, legally, transferred a portion of the original disputed land, a strip along the orchard's eastern edge, the most fertile section of the property, back into the Rathore family's name, not as charity but as correction. Priya, at her own insistence, was the one who planted the first new sapling on that returned strip of land, a young mango tree, with the entire Rathore family and the entire Chaudhary family standing together to watch. Survived the night, and the next. Within 2 weeks, its first new leaves had unfurled, small and pale green and utterly ordinary. The most beautiful thing, Priya said later, she had ever seen a plant do. The old ash-colored tree in the main orchard, the 90-year-old one that had gone bare overnight, began budding again the following spring, the first new growth anyone had seen on it in over a year. Priya still gardens, now more than ever, but she says it feels different. Less like a test she's terrified of failing, more like a conversation she's finally allowed to be part of. She and the Rathore family's youngest daughter, close in age, have become unlikely friends, meeting for tea most weeks, a friendship that both families quietly recognize as its own kind of repair. She thinks often about how close her own fear came to convincing her that she herself was the problem, that something was simply wrong with her, rather than something being wrong with the ground she was standing on, inherited unfairly and unexamined for 3 generations before she ever arrived. I almost believed I was the poison, she says now. It turned out I was just the first person who finally noticed the wound. So here's something worth asking about your own family's land, your own